Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from Demosphere, I'm talking about the 1993 debut album from Seefeel, Quique. That is apparently how it's pronounced. Alright, this was a big one. Seefeel was a four-piece band consisting of Mark Clifford, Sarah Peacock, Darren Seymour, and Justin Fletcher, though the latter two left the band years later and were replaced by Kazuhisa Ida and Shigeru Ishihara. Also, their engineer, Mark Van Hoen, was an official member during some points as well. This isn't a band that has all that deep a history when you look into them on the surface. Since their formation in the early 90s, they've released 3.5 studio albums. First, this one is their debut effort in 93, then their sophomore album Succor in 1995, then a mini album CH Vox in 1996, a long period of inactivity, and then a self-titled comeback album in 2011. And they've also released a couple of EPs, and bandleader Mark Clifford has put out a couple of solo records under aliases like Disjecta and Wooden Spoon, as well as having done a few collaboration records with people like Mira Kalix, among others. The rest of the members, aside from Clifford, also formed a short-lived side band called Scala, which released 2 albums at the end of the 90s, but that's about as deep as their catalog goes. And still, they made such a big impact with the couple of releases they did put out that they're still often brought up as among the best and or most influential bands of the 90s for their mix of shoegaze and early post-rock styles with electronic sounds that put their sound surprisingly close to that early IDM scene starting to form at the time. They were also some of the earlier signees to Warp Records, although this particular album was released on 2 Pure, the same label that Stereolab released their debut on. I myself had known about these guys for a long time, since not only did Aphex Twin come in to remix their track Time to Find Me right when they were first starting to break out, but also Audiker randomly set aside some time in 2003 to remix their track Spangle nearly a decade after the original dropped, just because, I guess. Seefeel, they're not talked about often, but they are a pretty big deal. However, despite their close proximity to such legends in the electronic music world, I'd never actually gotten around to hearing on any of their projects before this request was sent in. If you want to hear some of my quick thoughts on their later albums, I've generally enjoyed what I've heard, though I don't know if I could say I was in love with any of them. I thought it was cool how Succor really doubled down on the electronic side of their sound while ditching most of the rock elements of their previous work, which probably stood out a lot more in the context of 1995. Though coming back to it from a modern context, it just kind of reads to me as like a regular IDM ambient techno album that doesn't really stick out to me as anything incredible within the context of that scene and era. Like a combination of sounds from Aphex Twin Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 with other sounds that Audiker would go on to explore to even more successful and unique results later that same year on Try Repeat. Good, but not the most memorable or exciting for me. CH Vox was an interesting turn for straight dark ambient with a particularly strong closer. I think I did like that a little more than Succor. And their self-titled, to balance those out, ended up leaning a lot more into their shoegaze and rock side with a few glitchier flares. 2 okay enough results, although ending up even samey or more monotonous in my opinion. All nice records that I can see the appeal of and get why they'd have their dedicated fans, but none of which feel like the kind of thing that I'd really see myself coming back to. It's true that their debut here probably benefits from my having listened to it the most, what with it having been the one that I've actually been asked to review. But even if I'd only listened to this album once, as is the case with their others, I still think I'd set it apart as my easy favorite out of all of them, just for being the most effective combination of all their sounds and influences that best demonstrates what sets Seefeel in particular apart from the crowd, and what they can deliver that no other bands or artists do. To me, probably the best track on this album, or at least the one that best exemplifies all their strengths through showcasing all of them together at once, is the third track here, Industrious. A track that compositionally sounds like all those classic artificial intelligence era ambient techno cuts that you'd hear on projects like Audiker's Incunabula, B12's Electrosoma, Polygon Window Surfing on Sine Waves. There's all these like metallic clanging percussion textures and warm synth pads that have that very 90s texture to them to perfectly fit within that era. But at the same time, aside from the pads, the rest of the track's instrumentation feels a lot more organic than anything you'd hear out of those other projects. The percussion feels like it's fitting into techno formulas, but also like it's being played live. There's also a solid bass line introduced to deliver more of a groove. And as the track goes on, all these shoegaze and post-rock elements start to slowly come more and more into focus as Sarah Peacock's wordless vocalizing envelops the entire mix, as do other pads made out of guitars, to make all these very pretty and expansive soundscapes that you'd never hear in quite the same way on any of those other projects in this era, either on the electronic or the shoegaze side. Or also mixing those elements in the reverse direction, you also have a track like Imperial, which builds all these synths and wavering melodic lines, making them blur together in this giant monolithic soundscape. It's a track that compositionally at its core feels like it was made from more of a shoegaze-leaning ethos, but sounds like it was made entirely out of those 90s electronics. It's the combination of both of these worlds and the way they so organically fit together that actually made Seefeel something special. Now, the rest of the album isn't always trying to balance those two worlds equally in the way those two particular tracks can. Much of the rest floats between leaning more on the electronic side or the rock and shoegaze sides of things, but they're still pretty much always presented in such a way where they feel like they belong together. On the rock side, you got a track like Plainsong, which feels like it's directly repurposing the monolithic synth riffs from Imperial into a new, much more guitar-driven context with a shuffling beat, and once again, Sarah Peacock's voice enveloping the entire mix and giving the whole track that much more of a calming and expansive atmosphere. If I'm not mistaken, that was also the only track from this album released previously through their early EPs, and I can see why they thought it would go down well enough to also include on this album and sell more people on it. On the electronic and ambient side, you can get a track like Through You, which hits on a very similar note to something like Aphex Twin's Helios Fan, and I do not make a comparison like that lightly. I mean, the percussion on this track is a lot more delicate and plinky and laid back than that particular track. It focuses more on its underlying ambient pads to drive things, but the atmosphere those pads add up to comes together fantastically and manages to feel more driven and determined in its own separate way. And there's also the closer Signals, which is completely ambient and consists of nothing but synth pads. Hits on a very similar note to Aphex Twin's Rhubarb before that track even came out, but also without stepping on that track's toes. Signals has a much more muted and subtle feel to its melodic progressions than Rhubarb does. Really effective closer in either case. Also, in between all of that, there's another influence outside of just shoegaze and early IDM that plays a pretty heavy part in this album, and that's dub. Multiple tracks here very obviously incorporate those dub influences into their mix. Obviously, one of them is filter dub, which plays the formula straight in its very standard set of dub-style drum patterns and bass lines, as all these distorted guitars wail away in the background. Also, there's some xylophone-ish sounds on that one that show up throughout the second half. And I like xylophones. But the other big, obvious dub track here is Polyfusion, showcasing that style in the drums and bass lines again, with especially that rim shot feeling very dubby, but combining that with a lot more of those shoegaze elements, as the guitar pads take up a lot more of the mix and seem to suffocate everything in a good way, providing an interesting tune out of the way like the feedback wavers up and down. Also with Sarah Peacock's barely audible voice added in to add that extra sense of warmth and comfort and melody to a track that would otherwise feel almost very harsh and menacing otherwise. Now, there are admittedly a couple of moments on this album that didn't work as well for me, and I would be less pulled in than some of the other tracks here. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the band's fans really came after me for this. But, oddly enough, I don't think this album had the most impactful of openers in climactic phase number 3. I mean, it's nice enough. It creates this very bright and triumphant major key vibe out of its soaring guitar loops and pads going over its much lighter and more organic percussion and dubby bass line. It makes sense as an opener, lets you know what you're getting into in terms of the album's tone and scale, but not only do I feel like it's a slow start, I feel like it's one of those moments where the impact may have been sanded away by time as other later post-rock acts turn to sound like this into more of a cliche formula. It might feel a little too saccharine to win me over in the same way that other tracks here could. I also wasn't crazy about Charlotte's Mouth. That was another track that kind of combines all these squelching guitars and synths with a decent laid-back and organic groove formed by the light live drumming and the dub bass line. It's also very nice, though in context does feel like a bit of a drop in energy level where it feels like the album's pacing slowed down on an already pretty slow-paced album. Again, a good track, just not really one I would find myself actively looking forward to. And there's also my feelings on the album as a complete whole. I mean, for all the praise I've given to this album, how well I think its particular brand of influences organically comes together and is able to make it stand apart from the crowd, as well as how I can see how it may have influenced other much more well-known artists in the same spheres, I'm very close to loving this album, but it might still come up a tiny bit short of hitting that level for me, for the very simple reason that it has a strong tendency to fall into the background. Now, that in itself may just be by design. Like, these 9 tracks are not really notable for the amount of progression or evolution they have to them. They use their lengthy runtimes of 6, 7, 8 minutes to just build vibes to sink yourself into, rather than be the kind of thing that benefits a lot from, like, actively sitting up and paying attention to everything going on. They all kind of feel like languid jam sessions, and can certainly hit well in that particular context. But I am maybe left wishing that the emotions it's trying to convey were able to hit me on a more visceral level than they currently do, and I imagine they very much already do for the core fan base. Maybe this is the kind of thing where I'll come back to it a few years from now and it'll click with me more as I develop something sort of resembling nostalgia for it, which I don't really have at the moment, as I've only been listening to this album for about 3 weeks so far. I don't know. But regardless of my lack of strong personal connection with it, I can pretty much confirm that this album is as much of a classic as it's purported to be. The kind of overlooked 90s gem that really exemplifies certain trends of the time but is able to rise above them and turn them into something that feels more timeless. The kind of thing where you can hear exactly how it left an impact on other bands or artists adjacent to them, which have since seen way more access and attention than them. It was something special in 1993, and it's still something special 30 years later. I think exactly 30 years as of, like, last week. So, make sure to give it a shot. I'm overall feeling a strong 7.7 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.